we have woken up belatedly to the results of behaving as though scarcity could be indefinitely deferred. The ecological crisis makes this painfully clear. We've woken up less rapidly and definitively to the effects of displacing labour costs onto undeveloped economies. The short-term benefits to local employment in these settings, and in lower prices elsewhere, cannot offset longer-term issues about security of employment. Jobs will move when labour is cheaper in other places. Not an unfamiliar scenario, I might add, for this part of the world. And thus also the problematic social changes brought about by large-scale movement towards new employment patterns that have no long-term guarantees. And one effect of this pattern is the creation not of a new consumer class, but of a new group of urban paupers in unstable developing economies, a phenomenon visible, for example, in some East Asian contexts. The move away from a realistic focus on scarcity and productivity or added value, and towards the virtualized economy of money transactions, has been deeply seductive, and over a limited time frame, spectacularly successful in generating purchasing power. Given that credit is not something that is naturally scarce in precisely the same sense that material resources are, inadequate regulation can, as already noted, foster the illusion that the money market is effectively risk-free, that money can generate money without constraint. In contrast to an economic model in which the exchange of goods is the basic process being analysed or managed, we have increasingly privileged and encouraged a model in which the process of exchange itself has become the raw material, the motor of profit-making. But, to repeat the point made so many times in the last few months, the problem comes when massively inflated credit is called in, when the disproportion between actual, measurable material security and what is being claimed and traded on the market is so great that confidence in the institutions involved collapses. Search for impregnable security, independent of the limits of material resource, available labour, and the time-consuming securing of trust by working at relationships of transparency and mutual responsibility, has led us to the most radical insecurity imaginable. Now, this is not the only paradox. In a recent essay in the monthly journal Prospect, Robert Skidelsky discusses why it is that a globalized economy has produced a resurgence of protectionism and nationalism, not to mention the political and economic domination of a single state, the USA. We have, he suggests, been seduced into thinking that the mere lack of frontiers in global technology means that we accept a common destiny with other societies and are firmly set on the path to integrated economic operations. I quote from him, "Globalization, the integration of markets in goods, services, capital and labour, must be good because it has raised millions out of poverty in poorer countries faster than would otherwise have been possible." But this Whiggish idea that all this represents an irreversible movement towards an undifferentiated global culture, and that a world without economic frontiers is natural, inevitable, and by definition benign, this rests on several very doubtful assumptions, rooted in an era that is passing, an era in which it was taken for granted that we began from a position of grave scarcity and moved towards unimpeded growth. But we're now in a position of what he calls partial abundance, that is, a generally higher standard of living globally, which at the same time is more conscious of the limits of our material and environmental resources. As a result, globalization is less obviously good news for the developed world. Quoting again, the economic benefits of offshoring are far from evident for richer states. Jobs drain away to places where labour costs are cheaper, and we end up paying more to foreign investors than we earn in international markets. And the temptation for such wealthier economies is thus towards protectionism, with all its damaging consequences for a world economy. It's one of the most effective ways to freeze developing economies in a state of perpetual disadvantage. It makes it impossible for poorer economies to trade their way to wealth, as the rhetoric of the global market suggests they should. Skidelsky argues that we need to take steps to reduce the attractions of relocating and offshoring in the first place, so that countries can focus afresh on their own processes of production, so as to keep both internal and external investment alive. As he says, the present situation favours economic agreements that give little or no leverage to workers and that have minimal reference to social, environmental, or even local legal concerns. Learning how to use governmental antitrust legislation to break up the virtually monopolistic powers of large multinationals that have become cuckoos in the nest of a national economy would also be an essential part of a strategy designed to stop the slide from opportunistic outsourcing towards protectionism and monitoring or policing the chaotic flow of capital across boundaries. We have yet to see how much of this is deliverable, but the thrust of the argument is hard to resist, either morally or practically. Morally, protectionism implicitly accepts that wealth maintained at the cost of the neighbour's disadvantage, or worse, is a tolerable situation, which is a denial of the belief that what is good for humanity is ultimately coherent or convergent. Such a denial is a sinister thing, since it undermines the logic of assuming that what the other finds painful, I should find painful too. And that's a basic element of what we generally consider to be maturely or sanely ethical behaviour. But practically, protectionism is another instance of short-term vision, securing prosperity here by making prosperity impossible somewhere else. In a global context, this is inexorably a factor in ultimately shrinking potential markets. And the wider agenda sketched by Skidelsky means also that commercial concerns would be prevented from overturning the social and political priorities of elected governments. The arguments around unrepayable international debt a decade ago repeatedly underlined the destructive effects of imposed regimes of financial stabilization that derailed governmental programs in poor countries and effectively confiscated any means of shaping a local economy to local needs. And we hardly need reminding of the distorting effect on a national economy, and on public ethics too, of being seen as a pool of cheap labour and a haven for irresponsible practices.